The engines of Flight 927 roared as the aircraft climbed through the turbulent night sky. The powerful gusts of wind buffeted the fuselage, rattling the overhead compartments. The flight had departed on schedule, but as it soared above the city, something began to go wrong. The controls stiffened, the autopilot disengaged without warning, and the aircraft lurched violently to the left. A deep shudder ran through the structure of the plane, and the passengers were thrown against their seats. Oxygen masks deployed from the overhead panels as the cabin lights flickered ominously. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Jake Holloway's hands clenched the yoke, his pulse quickening. This was his first official flight as a co-pilot, and already disaster was unfolding before his eyes. The altimeter spun downward at an alarming rate. The aircraft was descending, rapidly, uncontrollably. Captain Marcus Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with 3 decades of experience, quickly assessed the situation. The hydraulic pressure gauge was dropping, and the rudder pedals barely responded. The city skyline, glittering with thousands of lights, was fast approaching. Control towers and high-rises loomed dangerously close. Jake's mind raced. Emergency procedures flashed through his memory, but none accounted for such a rapid system failure. He reached for the communication panel, but the radio emitted only static. They were losing contact with air traffic control. The aircraft continued its downward spiral. The altimeter displayed numbers that shrank at an alarming speed. They had mere seconds to act. Jake forced his trembling fingers to move, overriding the primary flight systems in an attempt to reroute power. Sparks flared from the console, but the plane hesitated, resisting his command. A deafening alarm blared through the cockpit. Ground proximity warning. The plane was dangerously close to impact. Jake yanked the control column back with all his strength, his muscles straining against the sheer force of gravity. The engines roared in defiance, and the aircraft fought against the pull of impending disaster. The control tower loomed ahead, massive and unyielding. A collision was imminent. The force of their acceleration pressed Jake against his seat as he executed one final, desperate maneuver. The nose of the plane jerked upward in response, the entire fuselage groaning under the sudden change in trajectory. The underbelly of the aircraft skimmed over the tower, clearing it by mere meters. The windows of the tower flashed by in a blur, the terrified faces of air traffic controllers visible for only a fraction of a second. The plane rocketed upward, the turbulence rattling every rivet and bolt. In the cabin, passengers sobbed and clutched their armrests. Some prayed. Others sat in stunned silence, waiting for the inevitable. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to stabilize the aircraft. The controls, once stiff and unresponsive, now obeyed. They were still airborne. The city below receded as the plane climbed higher, the immediate danger passing. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly, his grip loosening on the controls. His gaze shifted to Jake, who still held the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. The silence that followed was deafening. The crisis had been averted, but the questions remained. Something had caused the system to fail, something that nearly sent them plummeting into disaster. The flight was far from over. As they regained some control, the plane's systems flickered erratically. Reynolds reached for the overhead switches, attempting to re-engage the autopilot, but it refused to respond. The hydraulic pressure was still dangerously low, and manual flight was their only option. The city lights below stretched endlessly, and any miscalculation could mean catastrophe. "We need to figure out what caused that failure," Reynolds muttered, scanning the controls. "Something isn't right." Jake wiped the sweat from his brow. His mind was still running at full speed, trying to process what had happened. He leaned over, checking the flight data recorder. The logs showed a critical malfunction in the primary avionics. Something had triggered a forced disengagement of their controls. "Captain, look at this," Jake said, pointing at the data. "This wasn't just a mechanical failure. Something shut us down manually." Reynolds' face darkened, Are you saying this was deliberate? Jake hesitated before nodding. It's possible. Maybe even likely. The cockpit fell into silence as the weight of that realization settled over them. If someone had intentionally sabotaged their systems, they weren't just fighting against a failing plane. They were battling an unknown force with lethal intent. Reynolds reached for the emergency transmission switch, attempting to contact ground control once more. Mayday, Mayday. Flight 927 requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. We've suffered a critical failure and need priority landing. Static. Then, a distorted voice came through. Flight 927, you are off course. You need to... The transmission cut off. Jake and Reynolds exchanged uneasy glances. Off course? That didn't make sense. Their navigation had been manually controlled since the failure. There was no way they had deviated. Jake quickly checked their coordinates. A chill ran down his spine. Their flight path had been altered. Somehow they were no longer heading toward the airport. They were being guided away from it. The realization hit both men at the same time. They weren't just in an emergency. They were in the middle of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. The aircraft continued forward, seemingly under an invisible force guiding it. Reynolds tried to manually adjust their heading, but the plane resisted, as if locked onto a new course. Jake's stomach churned. If someone had hacked into their systems, they had complete control over their fate. He turned to Reynolds, voice barely above a whisper. What do we do? Reynolds stared at the horizon, the distant glow of the city now behind them. We find out who's doing this, and we take back control before it's too late. The real battle was just beginning.